Perfect. I'm going to stop sharing so we can see your faces more closely. I want to pull up questions. Just to start off, we shared a little bit about your backgrounds on social media, and you all come from such diverse areas in neuroethics, covering different topics of focus. And we'd love to hear more about what neuroethics means to you. If you had to summarize it in 3 words, or 3 words that you think of when you hear neuroethics, what comes to mind?
For me, brains, ethics, and society. So we look at a lot of things related to brains and brain science, and think about the ethical, the legal, and the social implications, both of existing technologies, the way that we think about various disorders and how they are treated in medicine. And then we also think about things that are new and under development and may become really interesting and important in the future. That's more than 3 words.
I can go next. I guess I think a lot of these things through the neuro-law lens. I'm coming from law and neuroscience, so I'd say revolutionary, risky, and potential. Just because I think there's a lot. I guess if I can get a 4th, I'd say uncertainty, but that's captured in those other 3.
I think maybe I could go next. I think if I could summarize it in a sentence, the way that I would put it is understanding the societal implications of neuroscientific advancement with humility. So I think one of the things that, and again, I think that really reflects back to a lot of the uncertainty as we kind of progress in this field, and that being a core aspect of neuroethics.
Absolutely. It's a tough act to follow when 3 eloquent speakers say the things that you wanted to say. But I would say ethical, legal, social implications are the 3 words that I'd use of our advancements in the brain sciences, but also what the sciences of the mind can teach us about how our human societies have been and will continue to be. I like to use justice as one of my words, no matter what I do. So just the justice implications of any of the neuroscience work we do.
Thank you for sharing. It seems like the central core uniting all of the phrases and the ideas that we've shared is neuroscience and the brain and the mind in some way, shape, or form. So we'd love to learn more about what perhaps sparked your interest in neuroscience, and especially veering into the neuroethics realm.
So let's start backwards, I guess, this time. I'm from Jamaica, and I came to the United States to an undergrad degree. And I took a psychology course for distribution, sort of general education requirements. I'm giving you the long version. I should probably shorten it. But the neuroscience aspect was very fascinating to me, because at the time I thought if you liked the sciences, you had to be a medical doctor, right? So I didn't realize that there were other ways that you could learn about human behavior and other behaviors. And so anyways, I got really fascinated by behavioral neuroscience. And then I had to take responsible conduct of research sessions as I was a trainee scientist. And those RCR, research ethics, they would call it, were great. And I was one of the few students who was excited about it, as opposed to thinking about it as like a box that you just have to check off. So I was really fascinated by the responsible conduct of research and the ways in which that could dovetail with the interests I had in neuroscience research and neuroscience development. So that just was a natural progression for me as I became very interested in that. And I continued with my interest in science pedagogy. And I think looking at the societal implications of some of the neuroscience is a really great way to teach neuroscience. So this all sort of, shapes the way I think about neuroethics.
So maybe I could just go next. I'm a clinical psychologist, and my work is based in India. And I've also done research in terms of trying to understand how we can bridge detection and treatment gaps in a low resource setting. And actually, I was fortunate enough to have an opportunity to attend a really wonderful meeting called Our Brain, Our World, Ourselves a couple of years ago. And that was where I got to interact with other colleagues who were interested in the area of neuroethics. And that was when I kind of realized that actually a lot of the things that intrigued me about, you know, the various ethical aspects of what I was doing in my clinical practice, in terms of whether it was about challenges around consenting, about, you know, how we look at the data that we have, what are the areas that we work on in terms of, you know, the research questions that we ask, that these were things that were actually being studied under the field of neuroethics. So I kind of stumbled into the field of neuroethics, not really knowing that it existed. What really struck out for me at that meeting was the whole multidisciplinary nature of the field, and how wonderful it was to have colleagues from different areas actually sitting at the same table and talking about these issues. So that was kind of my trajectory into it. And I think one of the areas that I'm really passionate about is kind of bringing the more low resource LMIC perspective into these discussions, because this is against, I think my colleagues from these settings often talk about these issues, but we don't realize that these you know, could really come under an umbrella of neuroethics. So that's really where I'm coming from.
So interesting how everyone has come to the field. So I maybe a little bit different, was trained in law, politics, social sciences, economics, and really had no connection to the natural sciences until I encountered a graduate school professor at Harvard, Steven Pinker, who writes about cognitive psychology and brain science. And through a series of meetings and then long engagement, he's on our dissertation committee, I realized that the work I was doing, which was governing humans and humans' brains, or, you know, and thinking about policy in realms like education and law, and turned out to actually be brain stories. And that's the motto of our lab: every story is a brain story. So I am a latecomer to the natural sciences, but, you know, I guess now 15 plus years, but it's been a really fun journey. And we'll come to this later, I'm sure, but I can say that I had no idea when I was a student. If you had given me 1,000 options when I started graduate school, would I be doing this? It would not have been on that list. I just had no idea. And so I credit a lot of mentors along the way. And it's great that you all have this organization to spark these discussions. I would have loved that. And maybe I would have found it sooner.
As an undergraduate, I got a degree in film and worked for many years as a journalist. I was a film critic for quite a number of years, and working for a journalist on a regional newspaper. And I wanted to go back to graduate school and continue my education, and I was interested in philosophy. So I came into this sort of through studying philosophy, and especially bioethics and philosophy of mind. And my PhD dissertation was on emerging reproductive and genetic technologies. And then I had a postdoc fellowship in neuroethics up in Canada. And at the time, neuroethics was also primarily focused on emerging technologies in neuroscience. It was a period where there were a lot of really exciting new things happening. So not so different in terms of some of the issues that I had been thinking about and studying. I found that I was really interested in brain injuries. So I focused most of my work on sport-related concussion and on disorders of consciousness. And I continued to work on ethical and neuroscientific issues related to disorders of consciousness and also to brain death. And for me, because I came into this through bioethics, you know, which was this sort of perfect combination for me of law and medicine and philosophy, and that continues to be true for my work in neuroethics. And like Dr. Hue, I'm especially interested in issues of justice in the work that I'm doing lately. And in the last few years, I've been doing more work on animal ethics and the use of animals in neuroscientific research.
Thank you all for sharing. It's really wonderful to kind of see the evolution and growth of your interests over time? Because I think for a lot of us students, it's like, we feel like we have to know what our dream career will be like 30 years into the future. And exactly, shaking your head.
I have a daughter who's a junior in college right now, and trying to convince her that that's not true is like my life's work right now. So I hope that I can convince some of you that you do not have to have everything figured out when you're 20 years old. You really don't. I figured it out as I went along, and so far I'm doing okay.
Very reassuring here.
I actually always joke with my advisees. I tell them, I'm like, would you trust the decisions you made when you were 15? Like, that's essentially like, if you lock in and know exactly what you want to do, you're like, this is your 15-year-old self you're leaving in charge. So please be free to collect new information and adjust and change as you go along.
100%. We'll definitely come back to this idea of where can students go from here towards the latter half. And I'd love to touch on a couple of points that you all had brought up in terms of the multidisciplinarity and all these intersections that are built in. So I'm imagining that at meetings like the Neuroethics Society conference, or even in these kind of institutions and academic communities you're a part of, you're working with individuals who are coming from very different paths of education, lived experiences, different populations that they've worked with. So definitely, we all are perhaps oftentimes not even using the same jargon, and we're not definitely bringing the same exact perspectives. And in those cases, how do you help foster these conversations that are open to those kind of open-ended questioning, answering that doesn't just rely on one discipline, especially when you might be familiar with other folks' experiences?
I'll try. As I mentioned, one of the things I work on is animal ethics, and it probably won't surprise anyone that some scientists who use animals in research really don't like what I have to say, and sometimes find it threatening in a way. So I think it's really necessary, if there's going to be meaningful dialogue between disciplines where they have different, where their focus on what's important might be really different. And so for me, obviously it's going to be ethics, but for someone else who's actually doing that work in neuroscience, it might be really different. That everyone has to operate in good faith and be honest and be empirically informed. For me, I have to make sure I actually understand the science that I'm talking about, which means, you know, as a philosopher and someone more or less in the humanities, I have to really make sure that I know what I'm talking about there. And then we have to be able to set aside our own biases and our conflicts of interest, which I think is really hard for everyone to do. And it's just very challenging sometimes, but you know, you have to speak to people respectfully, understand or try to understand, you know, what their interests are and what their goals are, if you want to have a really meaningful but critical dialogue.
Maybe I could just kind of chip in there, and I think I completely agree with what Dr. Johnson was mentioning. And I think actually in terms of my work and what I was doing as a clinical psychologist, I actually saw there were a lot of similarities in terms of, you know, the kind of conversations that you would have with colleagues from multidisciplinary, you know, areas and the patients that I actually interact with. Because often a lot of the therapeutic conversations that you have are about very controversial topics, areas, aspects of lives. You're having these difficult conversations with people who are in, you know, they're charged conversations often. And I think one of the things that I think is really important and has helped me in these discussions has been really having a very non-judgmental kind of an approach and an attitude, because I think that's really important when you work in multidisciplinary teams. So I actually thought it was really great to see colleagues who shared that kind of a value in discussion of these kind of you know, challenging areas and issues. And I think that's really important in neuroethics.
to echo both comments so far, yeah, that multidisciplinarity is something that was attractive to me about neuroscience. So years ago, when I got my neuroscience degree, it was actually relatively uncommon to have a neuroscience undergraduate training because it is an interdisciplinary field. So in terms of science itself, neuroscience is biology, and there's some genetics, there's different types of pharmacology, there's all sorts of different aspects. And so in itself, neuroscience requires so much interdisciplinary thought, but still, sort of relegated to the sciences. And I thought that when we have complex problems, we actually need more of a interdisciplinary approach to solving them. And these are the problems that we're encountering, right? These ethically fractious problems that come up in neuroscience or neuroethics. And we keep finding ways to complicate our lives as humans and societies. We've just about figured out all the ways to make things really difficult. And so I think that this is a really neat opportunity to take different perspectives into consideration as we try to solve or even approach some of the issues that we have. Dr. Johnson mentioned the use of animals in research. As a graduate student, I developed a course called Animal Models. And at the time, I would get invited to give a guest lecture on animal models in my colleagues' animal welfare class. And so, I would take, and then I taught a course in the master's program later on as a postdoc, when I wanted to spend more time understanding the use of animals in research and the history of that. So that came up, but it's an important way to pay attention to different stakeholders, different perspectives, different concepts that might be driving what we're doing, and whether it's just that we've always done it this way, precedent, tradition, but challenging that status quo to make sure that we're comfortable with what we're doing and that we are doing better than we did before. So that's always been my love letter to science is, can we do a better job of what we were doing? Can we not make such a mess of it? Can we make sure that fewer individuals, fewer groups are harmed? And I just saw neuroethics as this really neat place to take in all these perspectives and do something useful with it.
These are all great comments. I would just add two things. One is that as a practical matter, I found that sharing time together and meals is really, really important. So we do a lot of law and neuroscience trainings. We'll have judges and neuroscientists and lawyers, and at the start, it's really hard to have a conversation because the word trial, for instance, means something completely different. All these words mean different. But if you just hang out for a while, you begin to realize, oh, we're both fans of the same sports teams, or you love to cook and I love to cook. And suddenly the conversation in our scientific and legal sessions becomes a lot different. The other thing I'd say is that, and I don't think it's unique to law, because certainly in neuroethics, other spaces as well, sometimes you do have to take a stand and you just have to say respectfully, this is where I'm going to be, and we might not be able to find common ground. It happens all the time in law, and especially in the US adversarial system. But again, I found that if there's that shared bond initially, that those disagreements can happen in a way that's ultimately productive, even if they're very vigorous disagreements. So that shared time together, I think, is really important.
Thank you all for sharing. Really love those aspects of, it seems like a lot of being grounded in humility, being open to listening, and giving space to one another and trying to minimize harm at the end of the day. Really, really great takeaway points there. We've spoken a little bit about communication between disciplines, between the folks who are behind the scenes of the field, trying to do great things, minimize harm. How about public engagement? It's kind of one of those big new frontiers in neuroethics that there's always discussion about. And there's so many exaggerated claims, misinformation about neuroscience technologies or miracle drugs and all these kind of topics in the news a lot of times. So how can neuroethicists be more effectively engaged in science communication efforts, promoting the evidence, and these kinds of public engagement conversations? And as a second part, what might those look like ideally?
This has been an ongoing challenge for neuroethicists, and it's one that we think about and talk about as a community a fair amount. You know, on the one hand, we're always looking for what's new and what's coming in order to anticipate and to head off problems that we see, right? Ethical problems, social or legal problems that new things might bring about, and we want to head them off before they emerge. But on the other hand, that sometimes can put you in a situation where you're actually contributing to the hype about something that may not ever come to pass. And so it's important to really understand, you know, the science, and to be able to think creatively, I think, about the implications, but not so creatively or so imaginatively that it borders the absurd, right? One example is a few years ago, this technology came out of Yale, where they were perfusing the brains of dead pigs, right? So this new technology called BrainX, and all of the headlines about that were like reanimated pig and Frankenpig, and you know, all of these things that sort of created this public image that they had these, you know, dead pigs walking around, which of course was not true. And many neuroethicists, including myself, were interviewed about that. And part of what you want to do there is sort of tamp down those you know, hyped up expectations about what's happening, and really try to communicate effectively about what you think are truly important aspects of that. And of course, any of us who've been interviewed by the press in the past know that you might talk to them for 20 minutes and they're going to take one sentence out of what you say, and you don't know how they're going to use that sentence, right? And so to some extent, once your words leave your mouth, they're somewhat out of your control, and you have to hope that what you said doesn't get taken out of context.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll say in terms of public outreach, even before I was interested in neuroethics specifically, I've always been interested in science literacy. And one of the things I was concerned about was, if you understand something more about the subject, then it can either take the concern out of it, or it can actually increase the concern. And so I find myself, there are certain things that, you know, as Dr. Johnson mentioned, hype, when they show up in the news, and I'm like, why are people stressed out about this? I think if you understood the science, you wouldn't be, but why are you not worried about this other thing? Like, why are you cool with this thing? Do you not know? And so I spend a lot of time thinking about what are the really valuable parts of information that the public is missing, and you know, our lawmakers understanding things that are actual threats, or certain things that are not. You know, I remember for a short while, lie detection was occupying the imagination, the moral imagination of folks, and they were worried about people like scanning your brains from far away. And I'm like, that's not really how it's going to happen. But there are some actual concerns, some present concerns that we're not thinking about, but they are there. And some of the issues around our privacy and our identity and what we're giving up online. And these are some of the other ways that people aren't particularly concerned. And so I just think that piece of how much education, how much outreach we're responsible for as the scientists, the producers, and for the consumers of that knowledge, right? Just that's always part of it for me. Is like, how much do we need to do? And the answer for me is a lot more. We have to definitely make sure that we're doing a little bit better job with educating public and taking perspective from them. So that co-creation of knowledge and understanding that different groups have something to tell us. We have to understand what the publics are thinking and what their concepts are in order to address them appropriately. And so it's this co-creation, or this sort of bi-directional education piece.
Maybe I could just kind of follow on from that in terms of, you know, what you're talking about, co-creation, because I think that's so important in terms of even just understanding what people, you know, in different from different contexts understand as being important. Some of the work that I do is in the area of cognitive enhancement. And when I started working in this area, I was, the people were talking about cognitive enhancement in terms of, technologies, like a pill. And these were the kind of ideas and approaches that people were talking about. And when we actually spoke to people in India to kind of understand what their views were on, what exactly does cognitive enhancement mean, and what do you think are, cognitive enhancement strategies? It was interesting to see that, the understanding of the term was a bit different, and that people actually thought education was what they wanted as a cognitive enhancement strategy. And I think that kind of like just puts in a perspective in terms of how, the way that a particular area of scientific research is kind of viewed, and can actually differ depending on the kind of context that you're coming from. So perhaps in low resource settings, this is what people are actually asking for. It is access to, say, quality education. And as neuroethicists, I think it's also important to kind of highlight those issues so that they come into discourse. And I absolutely agree with Dr. Johnson and Dr. Hue that it's really important that if you are a neuroscientist and you have that understanding, it's important to be able to give back to the community in terms of sharing your understanding of the scientific knowledge in a language that communities really understand. And I think I've always also been interested in science literacy and science communication, and I think that also the levels of that differ depending on where you're coming from and the kind of access that you have to various information. So I think that's almost like a responsibility of people who are interested in neuroethics.
Yeah, these are all great comments. I don't have much to add other than to say I'm happy that there seems to be a trend towards more participant-centered, patient-centered, community-engaged research and citizen science as well, and putting these technologies into the hands of citizens.
Thank you all. Really, really wide topic, a wide range of topics covered there. Kind of wanted to touch a little bit more, drawing from what Dr. Dasgupta you had mentioned with kind of the split in terms of knowledge dissemination and awareness between a lot of the academic centers that we are a part of, and also considering reach all the way through community members in LMICs, lower middle income countries, kind of this global perspective. I think all of us today are mostly based in the United States and Europe, I believe. And there are many individuals, collaborators, community members coming from across the world. As part of that, we definitely encounter some cultural barriers as well, linguistic barriers, in terms of stigma, perhaps with mental illnesses, right? Or adoption of technologies and so on and so forth. Kind of the idea of cultural relativism a little bit. We also don't want to adopt a one size fits all perspective when we're learning about a cultural community for the first time, right? And many, many other factors that are kind of more nuanced like that. So how exactly do we expand the scope of neuroethics to a more global, more culturally inclusive scale? I know there's not any, it's an open-ended area of discussion, but if you have any recommendations, we'd love to hear.
I mean, I think that's a really great question. And I think one of the things, the fact that we're actually sitting here and having this conversation is an indication that we're headed in what I think is the right direction. I think it is really about that, having that conversation, getting different people from across the globe to talk about things, as Dr. Shen was mentioning, really have that open collaborative discussion, which is often needs to be outside of the academic context. I completely agree with him that I think, with the amount that you can engage to understand about someone's culture outside of, the academic context is probably much more than, an academic discussion within it. So I think we need to think more creatively in terms of how we have these conversations, how we sensitize people who are working in academia to have, widen their perspectives on these things, and then communicate this, effectively back to communities. And again, keeping that whole co-creation piece in mind. So really kind of working with communities together in this. But I think, that open dialogue is really like a first critical step.
It's excellent. Some of my interests and concerns with globalization of the way we think about neuroethics or any sort of guidelines or principles, it's promise and peril, right? So one size fits all absolutely won't work. But in a global community that we're living in now, right? And so our capacity to interact with each other and to influence each other is greater than it's ever been. Within seconds and minutes, you're reaching into other parts of the world that would have taken years to communicate effectively with. So we have so many tools now to shrink our world, that it's tempting to try to find solutions, one solution for everyone. But that cultural competence is very important. And even within one country, for the United States even, there's so many different subcultures where something is absolutely appropriate or inappropriate. And I think that nuanced approach that neuroethics provides us is really useful. And now we can think about, are there sustainable, scalable strategies that we can suggest that allows folks to depart from it in whatever ways they need to, with, again, that justice piece being center. So if you're doing it, and you have these guidelines that can mitigate the majority of harms, then are there things that folks can engage with that and tailor it to make something meaningful for themselves? So I work with the Emory Tibet Science Initiative, and our goal is to teach science to Tibetan monks living in exile. On request of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, we're engaged in this really ambitious project, but making sure that there's no cultural imperialism, right? That it is part of, what do you want to know, and how can we help you, and how can you help us? What are the ways that you are going to enhance the way we think about things, and how can we, help you to answer questions that are important to you? Right. And so here's another set of tools that we have. Take what you need. And can we see some of your tools? So I think that cross-fertilization and making sure that we're not marketing something that isn't appropriate to another group is one of the concerns I have about this globalization. But definitely lots of opportunity for us to take, sort of like a buffet, take the parts that work, and pull together something meaningful in each situation.
I think it's important to recognize that a lot of the things that we think about in neuroethics and in the brain sciences are really very important to people, and not just to science, right? So things like our identity, right? There's this kind of Western notion that, our brains are really critical to who we are and to our identity, but it's very individualistic, and not all cultures share that kind of individualism. I've been working for some time on this project in the US. The Uniform Law Commission has been thinking about revising what's called the Uniform Determination of Death Act, which sort of lays out what counts as brain death. But brain death is not something that is recognized in all cultures and in all parts of the world. There are a number of religious traditions and cultures where they just absolutely don't accept that if your brain is not functioning, you are no longer alive, or you're no longer a person. So it's important to have that cultural humility, and to recognize that although around the world we have shared values and recognize what's important about our lives and what makes us flourish, that there are different ways that actually gets interpreted, and different ways in which that's important to people, right? And if we are trying to impose a particular sort of Western individualized worldview about something as important as death or personal identity, that this is a kind of ethical and cultural imperialism that we really need to be careful about, as a matter of justice, as a matter of respect, and as a matter of minimizing harm, and making sure that that minority voices and people in other parts of the world have, that we respect that they have an important viewpoint as well.
Yeah, once again, I just like see the previous three speakers for all the important points. I would just add that, and it came out in some of the comments, that in addition to global considerations, local considerations are really important. And so we've got a project related to what we proposed around neuroimaging and engagement and recruitment. And, you know, one of the dirty little secrets of virtually every neuroimaging study you've ever read, with the exception of some that have been really well funded and are really national, is that recruitment happens with a few Facebook posts and flyers around campus. And as a result, it's no surprise that the participants, those who are lucky enough to participate in this cutting edge, amazing field of neuroscience as participants, are a really small slice of even the local community. And you can be just a zip code away from a major research institution and never set foot in it. And that's a challenge as well. So some of the same issues that arise when you're thinking about engagement with someone or a community thousands of miles away could be the same with someone who's just down a couple bus stops away.
That's some really, really strong imagery right there. Absolutely, just in terms of even spatially, we haven't quite reached that level of dissemination. So it takes a lot more efforts. I also love the imagery of the buffet of knowledge. I think I'm going to be taking that away for sure. Also, a small sneak peek for some of the competitors who are participating in the debate matches later today. Dr. Johnson and Dr. Shen have kind of given a little bit of insight behind the scenes a little bit for some of the cases coming up. So they're mystery cases for now, but in a few hours, they'll probably be thinking, I see. So thank you all for sharing. I just want to take a brief pause here because I know we're 38 minutes past the hour to see if anyone in the audience has any questions. Feel free to drop them in the chat. Feel free to raise a hand on Zoom or physically if you want to turn on your video. We're happy to call on you. Take a few moments to think over that. In the meantime, oh, Ashley, perfect timing. Let me ask you to unmute. There we go.
Okay, so what do you think is the most pressing issue in neuroethics right now?
Hi, Ashley. I'm going to jump in and tell you. So I have two kids, 9 and 12 years old, and they're always asking my favorite anything, your favorite thing. And I'm like, oh gosh, I like so many things. And what's your favorite movie? Oh my gosh, I like so many movies. What's your favorite color? Every color. So yes, what's the most pressing issue in neuroethics? All of them. Because what's important to me is going to be a little bit different. I not hard to imagine I'm going to say justice, and that if I color everything with that respect and justice lens, then every issue, I think, as it arises. So I know that's sort of a punt and a cop-out, and I'll let the other speakers say, but for me, justice becomes really important with everything that we consider, whether it's the research we're doing, whether it's, the guidelines that create the ability for people to do really, really heinous things. Just making sure that we are not invading and destabilizing folks' identities, and that shows up in every aspect, whether it's drugs or technology. And so just that's the most important part for me, is making sure that people are able to be free.
Just to expand on that a little bit, but take it in a slightly different direction, that there is something of a crisis across the life sciences in the way that the use of animals and animal models has really failed to result in benefits to humans, and lots of research that really doesn't work out. And I think there's a real crisis there in thinking about how we use our resources, including our knowledge and ingenuity, but also including how we use animals. And this relates absolutely to the justice piece, because, we are using taxpayer money. We are using money that we might use to benefit humans in real and tangible ways, but instead, we're doing other things with it in pursuit of goals that not everyone shares. So, and the piece, of course, if you're concerned about animal welfare and what we're doing to animals, then we also need to think about, are we using them just because it's easy to use them, because you can buy mice from a breeder, or are we using them because they actually advance the science? And I think it's because it's easy to use them. And we used to use humans in the same way. We used vulnerable humans in research because they were accessible and it was easy to use them. I think that's a real issue across the sciences, but of course in neuroscience as well. And something that we're really going to have to come to grips with very soon.
Yeah, I mean, my instinct is same as Gillian saying that, it's everything. But if I had to pick one, I think it's probably to avoid the echo chamber of a field developing and multiple fields, overlapping fields in neuroscience and society. And so I would say a more representative and an inclusive group is really, to me, foundational. And I would say that includes, of course, things like racial and ethnic diversity, but also ideological diversity and political diversity, because if a area of scholarship and thought becomes totally aligned with one set of policy outcomes, I think it can really undermine the field. And I think this field of neuroethics is so foundational because our brains are so foundational to everything. Obviously, it's not just brains, it's brains and environment integrated with the rest of the body, but the brains are the key player, at least in my view. And so to unlock the true potential, which I don't think has been done yet, I think there's got to be, this really representative, inclusive group who are like, okay, yeah, we disagree vehemently, but we agree that the brain is central, and we agree that addressing these questions, even if we don't think that we don't know where to go with it, we don't agree. To me, that would be the first place to start.
Yeah, I mean, I again agree with Gillian in terms of every area is really important. But again, coming at it from my perspective in terms of, coming from an LMIC context and looking at it from a low resource setting, I think one of the areas that I think about a lot is the concerns around, as we're really going to be pushing towards more diverse, inclusive kind of research, I think, there are going to be areas and concerns around data privacy or, ownership, even just around disclosure and things like that, which are going to become increasingly important to look at and think about as you work with more diverse groups and in diverse contexts. And I always think about it from, being a therapist, I always think about it from a clinical aspect in terms of, what does this mean for people who don't have access to services? And it's really a bit of a chicken and an egg situation in terms of what do you develop first? Do you look at strengthening, services for people, or do you work on the research? And how does that feed back in? And and I think these are, I think that's really an area that is of concern and something that I think about.
Thank you all for sharing, and great question, Ashley. Next, we have Jenna with a question.
Hi, thank you all so much. I've really been enjoying the panel so far and just hearing about all your perspectives. So I at least am very interested in science communication, just learning more about what you've been saying. I just think neuroethics is also a really good thing to talk about as I want to get into science communication. So I just kind of want to know how do people I know you kind of talked about how you got into the fields, but I just don't even really know if I wanted to get more into it, or just how do people get more involved in neuroethics, or even if they're not kind of a main role neuroethicist, I want to also go into molecular neuroscience research. So how do I make sure I'm bringing in neuroethics topics into that?
I'm slow to answer because I was typing in the chats. Jenna, where are you? What level are you in terms of your educational adventure right now? I'm trying to say, college, high school, graduate, where along the path are you?
Yeah, sorry, I couldn't unmute for a second. Yeah, right now I am a senior in undergrad.
Yeah,
And
perfect.
so I just applied to grad school.
Okay, wonderful. And again, I'm not talking directly to you since there are other folks on the conversation, but academia is a really nice place right now to be able to get engaged. But there are other opportunities coming along, nonprofits. So for instance, Institute of Neuroethics, which I'm a founding member. We have catalyzers and looking for folks who might be able to contribute some energy and their expertise and their willingness to gain more. So different research groups or different policy groups, there's startup companies who are looking for folks who can help engage them with science communication. And so I'm thinking a little bit about where you can access some of this. And neuroethics is still quite new, right? Our annual meeting this year was the 16th annual meeting, which, one of our presenters mentioned something about being an adolescent, right? And so we're still in that phase of trying to figure things out. And so the path to becoming fluent in and conversational about neuroethics is wild and varied still. There isn't a charted path. So the thing I'll say is be bold, and consider what you're interested in and how you might be the one to introduce that to the group. So let's say you go to grad school, they might not be doing neuroethics, but you can be the conduit that exposes them and gets folks excited about it. A lot of grants now require some kind of public outreach or communication or are being rewarded. And so you might be able to find funding that allows you to engage your academic group in that way.
I'm a little biased here, and as I mentioned, I'm fighting this struggle with my own daughter who's in college right now. But I teach at a medical university and a medical school now, and one of the things that we see is that we want people to come out of medical school as good doctors, right? As well-rounded physicians who can think ethically and also cure your illness. And the problem is that when they're in college, we're basically making them take math and biology and organic chemistry and all of these other things in the sciences. I say, take philosophy, take literature, take a bioethics course if it's offered where you are, and actually, start to think critically and creatively about things that are problems or things that might be problems. Think of how to think about scientific research as an issue of justice, as an issue of ethics, and that's just really valuable, right? You're going to get, if you're in the sciences, you're going to get really sort of pushed into this narrower and narrower stream throughout your education. And every time you can sort of take a little side trip and do something else, I think it's worth doing.
Yeah, just two quick things. One is it doesn't exist yet, but because I think all of us have received so many similar questions, Jenna, and there isn't a go-to resource quite yet. The Dana Foundation has been kind enough to fund us to create a platform, a web platform for a career network, broadly in neuroscience and society, so things like neuroethics, but also educational neuroscience, neuroscience in the classroom and other places. So I'll put this link in the chat, but we're actually just hiring now. We just got the grant. So if folks want to be involved in creating these sorts of platforms, we'd love to have you on the team so that I could, when you ask that question, say, oh yeah, in addition, here's the website where we've got Zoom conversations with people who've made different decisions. The only other thing I'll say is that at some point, not yet, but at some point, you do have to make a decision about sort of what you're going to be. And I have this conversation a lot with students who are thinking about, say, a joint JD PhD. They like law, they like neuroscience, and there's someone like probably many of you in this call, you've always been able to do it all. You do this and this and this and that. Great. You can't keep doing that. Doesn't mean you can't love all those things, but it does mean you can't keep doing all those things. So at some point, my conversations usually go, do you want to be a lawyer who has a knowledge of science? Or do you want to be a scientist in the lab who's got a great knowledge of law or ethics, and I've got a colleague, I always think about this, I'll give him a credit, Larry Steinberg, who's probably the leading thinker in law and neuroscience on adolescent development. So there are all sorts of criminal cases where adolescents have been charged and convicted and then get sentenced to these really, really long sentences. And Dr. Steinberg testifies, and I've heard him say multiple times, he say, how do you get involved in law and neuroscience? He says, if you want to be a scientist, be the best scientist you can be, because then the courts will listen to you. So it's just, you've got to find your own path. There's not a right one, but there is a path. Like, you can't keep doing all the paths all the time. But you're asking the right questions. Great question.
So I'm just going to add a line in there, coming from again a low resource kind of context where again the field of neuroethics is really nascent, and I think I often joke with colleagues that neuroethics is something that I do for a hobby. It's, there isn't really a go-to place. I think the International Neuroethics Society is fantastic in terms of the kind of opportunities that it provides to interact with colleagues. But again, I think it is really about thinking, is this an area which you're passionate about? If it is, see how you can include it in your work. It doesn't have to be the entire focus of your work, but definitely look at one aspect of it with that lens, and keep at it. I think it's also about, if neuroethics is a younger field, but that also means there's a lot of opportunities to kind of create paths. And if there's anyone from a low context background who's interested in talking more about it, I'm happy to get in touch.
Thank you all. Related to, Cora had a question in the chat about applying to undergraduate programs as well. And Dr. Gillian, I just wanted to give a quick shout out to the Neuroethics minor program if you're interested in chatting about it.
Oh yeah, that's really cool. Thank you. Yeah, Emory has right now probably the only neuroethics minor. We worked pretty hard to formalize a structure that looked a lot like what our students were already trying to do. So they were cobbling together an academic experience that would give them some expertise in neuroethics. And like what they would do is we take some neuroscience courses and some philosophy courses or some sociology and just economics, like all sorts of different things. And so we built out a minor that supports that and gives you something written on your transcript. I'm hoping that other institutions will, with the resources to do that, will follow suit, and that there will be places to do that. I am happy to share my curriculum and my plans with any institution that's interested in engaging deeply with this and willing to put that work in. I'm thrilled to share and disseminate. So right now, yeah, there are probably places where you would have to be the architect of that degree or major. But yeah, you can root it in anything. Again, we're so interdisciplinary that some of the neuroethics minors have majors from sciences to humanities, social sciences across the board. We have folks who are interested in engaging in everything.
And there are a few programs in the US where there are postdocs that are pretty interdisciplinary. There's a group at the University of Washington, for example. I did mine in Canada. I know that there are still a few up in Canada where there are limited opportunities, but they're certainly looking for people with diverse backgrounds who can work in neuroethics. And a postdoc is just a really valuable opportunity to have protected time to actually work on and write papers and do the actual work.
Wonderful, thank you all. Now Alexia's had their hand up for a while, so let's see if they can unmute.
So this question is for Dr. Dasgupta. What made you decide to be a psychologist, and how would you get more involved in the field of neuroethics and psychology in 8th grade?
So did you say you're in 8th grade? I couldn't quite get the last bit of that.
That's what I heard.
Okay. Well, I mean, firstly, I think it's fantastic that you is that right? Okay. Great. I mean, I think that's it's really interesting that you're already thinking about that. But I think one of So one of the things that got me interested in psychology was that I was just really super interested in people and trying to understand behavior. And as I read more about it, I just got more and more interested in it. I think one of the things that I would probably encourage you to do is just keep a really open perspective right now. You know, don't, again, a lot of what I would resonate a lot with what Dr. Johnson was saying. You don't have to know it all right now. I think I've become a better psychologist as I've gained more experience through life. I mean, I know that doesn't quite sound right the way that I'm saying it, but it's kind of true. You have to be open to experiencing a lot of the things that you read about in you know, textbooks, and I think that does, and be open to reflecting on that. So I think, and that also comes when you think about you know, if you know, the ethical issues that you might encounter you know, going along whatever career trajectory you choose to take up. So I mean, I would just say, if you're interested in psychology, you know, look at whatever information, access to resources that you have, understand it, but also keep a very open mindset about not zeroing in on something right now. Allow yourself to really explore different areas, because you don't really, you know, it takes a while to kind of figure out what you're interested in, and that may change, and that's also fine.
Thank you all. We only have 3 minutes left. Time has flown by. So everyone, if we could join together in a virtual round of applause for our awesome guest speakers. Thank you for your time, especially on a weekend, on hopefully what is a beautiful Saturday. We really appreciate you being here.
Thank you. It was great to speak to all of you.
Thank you for having us. I'm sorry if we didn't get to some of the questions in the chats, but I'm happy to be available by email if someone wants to check in with me. I'm happy to chat.
Would it be okay if we shared your EDU emails with students when we're following up with the recording? Okay, perfect. You'll be sure to include that in.
Thank you. It's been really great to interact with everyone. And yeah, I'm happy for anyone to reach out by email.
Thank you all. Take care. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you. Good to see you all. Panelists too.
Bye. Have a good weekend.
Have a good one.
All right. Well, everyone, let me start recording.